Ja, Dr. Eberhard, wir wollen uns in dieser Folge von
Dr. Eberhard, in today's episode of Thanatology Up to Date, we'd like to take a look at materialistic and naturalistic explanatory approaches of near-death experiences. We tend to hear and read about explanations that eventually point towards the idea that near-death experiences are somehow developed in the brain, and that they are not real experiences. According to your view, have there been found any satisfying and global explanations regarding this phenomenon?
Vielleicht wird das ja nie. Das ist ein ganz schwieriges Unterfangen. Also wie will
Maybe this will never happen. It's a very difficult endeavor because how can we prove that near-death experiences occur inside or outside of the brain? Of course, we've got everyday experiences so that everything we think and do has at least an electrophysiological correlation in the brain. This is something we can measure with our brainwaves, and we can also see that injuries of the brain can lead to malfunctions of these activities. And this indicates that experiences are located in the brain. Except for these borderline experiences, such as near-death experiences, where people experience this in a way where they say, I clearly didn't use my body, I was outside of my body and looked down at it. And also, all these paranormal experiences, they all point towards something else. Well, I think as long as there is this division of interpretations which depends on the inner attitude of people, these things won't change in the near future, because there is no ultimate proof for both aspects, for both views and ways of thinking.
According to your view, is there a purely naturalistic approach that explains the complexity of near-death experiences?
Nein, das blieb bis heute aus und eigentlich relativ gründlich.
No, not yet, because eventually near-death experiences are so complex and they're filled with paranormal phenomena, which are so frequent that they're actually a normal aspect in this context. And therefore, an explanation on a physiological and psychological basis cannot be, let's say, satisfying. In a way, it's even massively restricted, so we shouldn't even name it or take it seriously anymore. If we take an example, such as oxygen theory, the theory of lack of oxygen, which had been spread quite early on, even in those times, they could have realized rather quickly that a big proportion of near-death experiences occur without any lack of oxygen, and therefore the theory already cancels itself out without building these big constructs of ideas.
If such an explanation does not exist, how can it be that we are so easily satisfied with such alleged explanations? Why do such explanations find so much resonance in some media?
Ja, weil die halt naturalistische oder materialistische oder auch
That's because they have materialistic but also editorial views and only focus on the matter because this view is very predominant and leading. Things have changed drastically. About 200 years ago, it would have been difficult or even dangerous to say, well, something like the hereafter doesn't exist. To imagine something like a god couldn't exist is absurd. And today, the opposite is the case, and it's even shameful to take a clear position in public. At least that's the case in scientific circles. I think that has really changed by 180 degrees. If somebody claimed that the best explanation for near-death experiences, for its complexity and also for paranormal phenomena, is based on the simple fact that we actually have a soul, and with this soul, we can leave our body, and that we have a consciousness. So it doesn't need a brain to exist. Then this view would be shameful too. It just shouldn't be that way. This can't be taken seriously, and insofar a newspaper is always on the lookout for news and information. But they don't need to be credible. And then we've got these pieces of information that just pop up out of nowhere. Let's take the example of the following explanation, where near-death experiences are supposed to be caused by epilepsies in the temporal lobe. For a long time, this was seen as a serious explanation, but if you take a closer look, there isn't much behind it. The idea started with one person having a sort of illusionary misjudgment of her body awareness. When her temporal lobes were stimulated, she had the feeling that she was floating. If we take a closer look at this, it's very rare that epilepsies produce a sort of schematic disruption or disruptions of the body awareness. But not even in this small field of out-of-body experiences, it is possible to explain the questions surrounding near-death experiences, because the people who've had a near-death experience, out-of-body experiences actually happen, and they can make these observations. What I mean is, they see their own body, they see people that do things around them. These are all things that people who have an epilepsy wouldn't see. They even see this as an illusionary misjudgment, and that something isn't quite right with their body. They have a feeling of alienation, and this isn't the case at all for people who've had a near-death experience. So this explanation doesn't even apply to this small area of out-of-body experiences. And still, this theory is given a serious vessel or platform because the researchers oftentimes don't understand much or hardly anything about the whole complexity of near-death experiences. And of course, journalists aren't really to blame here, because journalists look for information, and if they get it from somebody who can be taken seriously, they trust this person. It's very understandable. I would even say the ones who are more to blame are the ones who call themselves skeptics, and just doubt everything and don't use their skepticism to do more research in this field and tackle the topic in a scientific way.
How have you experienced the handling of this topic on a scientific level? Is there a serious and clean-cut discussion going on?
Well, now you're drawing me down a slippery slope. I'll have to take a stand now. Maybe I'd like to... Let's take an example from my own experience, which happened quite recently. I gave a workshop at a medical congress in Switzerland where I reported on near-death experiences. There was also a colleague of mine who joined me, who had experienced a near-death experience herself, which was very valuable at the workshop. And after this workshop, 2 or 3 people came by and told us, there was this introduction we missed. During this introduction, a medical colleague of yours talked about this study. He apparently said that some people wanted to prove that out-of-body experiences are real. And apparently, an auxiliary nurse in England had placed a number on patients' chests during their reanimation. And the patients were supposed to recognize this number. And eventually, the person who told us about this said, you can imagine how useful the results were. As far as I know, this study doesn't exist in this form, but I can imagine quite well what study this person was referring to. I asked him again later on, and even sent him an email. We also had a phone call, but I never got any answers to my questions. However, since I'm quite well informed in this field, I think I know what he was referring to. There is an auxiliary nurse from England called Penny Sartori, who did this famous study, and during this study, they tried to put some boxes in the intensive care room that could only be seen from above. They were not put on the chests of patients, and these boxes were hidden in intensive care wards in several countries, in England, the US, Austria, and they were hoping that the patients would have a near-death experience with an out-of-body experience during their reanimation, and that they could take a look at the content of the box in the intensive care room. In the end, of all the people who had been examined, only 2 patients had an out-of-body experience. One of these 2 didn't want to give any information, and the other person had the reanimation outside of the intensive care ward. So the out-of-body experience didn't happen in a room where a box had been placed. However, this person had an out-of-body experience and sensed a physical experience that turned out to be correct. although this person shouldn't and couldn't have sensed anything during the time of the reanimation. And this person was able to look at the corners of this room outside of the body and sense everything. So in the end, this study showed that the idea of out-of-body experiences is not ridiculous. The opposite is the case. They just didn't manage to present these boxes as proof. And you know, this bias and this rakish handling of the topic of near-death experiences is quite common. Well, most of my colleagues actually prefer not talking about it anymore. And unfortunately, there's only a few who are interested in the topic, and then most of them are skeptical. In the true sense of the word, skeptical. Well, skepsis is a Greek word. It actually means to do research. Nowadays, the word skeptic tends to be used for people who doubt things. So that would be somebody who turns doubt into the basic principle of recognition. However, if somebody calls him or herself a skeptic, then they should carry this original meaning with them. What I'm trying to say is that they may doubt, but then they should also do research, and then also in a way where they doubt near-death experiences and experiencing the hereafter. That's totally legitimate, but they should also make an effort and take a closer look. And there are only a few people, and even those I wouldn't really find in the German-speaking world. Maybe Alice Addo or Gerhard Wörle in the US. However, you can't really trust them to have a sober look at this because in their works, it's obvious that they want to reinforce materialism. And they do that in a way that isn't so clear-cut. Because, well, they make fun of the others. They even partially claim that the others are just a fraud, and the works of these skeptics clearly point towards that. So we have this counterpart that is missing. That's something we should really wish for. What I mean is that we need the counterpart of a serious naturalist who is, let's say, an idealist. Like, I would call myself an idealist. I don't exactly know where you can find these naturalists. But to be honest, we've got to say that this falsification and this insinuation or also simplification, that these things can also be found on the side of the idealists, and there may be even more so. And this is what idealism suffers from. There are even some researchers, luckily there aren't many of them, but there are researchers that include near-death experiences into their studies where we know that they didn't even happen. And they just added them to their studies, and of course, this has very damaging effects because idealists already have to cope with a lot of prejudice against them, because they're not seen as being reasonable and are often viewed as dreamers. And when these things are found out, then things are fiddled around with and falsified. Then this is even more disastrous than when these things happen in the natural sciences or in naturalism, where let's say it's already known and normal that these things happen. But it's not easy to shake the foundations of naturalism.
In recent years and decades, there have been done significant studies surrounding the topic of near-death experiences. Nevertheless, a serious scientific reappraisal and a serious discussion about this topic seems something that we can only wish for.
Yes, we have to wish for this and also to gain mutual respect for each other. It's just difficult because here it's not just about different scientific views, it's about faith. It's just, I think especially when it is about faith, many people who call themselves skeptics aren't really worthy of that name because they're just non-believers. They just don't believe that something like a near-death experience could be real. They can't believe in it, and being a non-believer often goes hand in hand with commenting these things in a negative way. Or they just can't believe it. They aren't skeptics in that sense that they doubt and then they go and examine this, but they just don't believe it, and that's a big difference. The majority of people and the majority of scientists are non-believers. However, they're not skeptics in that sense because they've dealt with this topic properly, and if, just in a very simplified way.
You are somebody who is a doctor and a scientifically oriented person who follows the hypothesis of survival. How did it come to that? Which developments have led to you joining the side of the idealists?
Actually none. I've always been an idealist. That goes really far back. And still, science, which has had a big influence on me, was never able to shake this idealism because it's like that. Science has achieved a lot of knowledge, especially when we take a look at the brain. It's fantastic what we found out about the brain, how it works, the synapses, how neurons and transmitters are involved in it. And still, there is no organ that hasn't been examined for such a long time. But when it comes to its functionalities and the creation of consciousness, we can't understand it, not even closely. Or we don't even know where consciousness is placed at, how it works. In this field, we haven't actually come a step closer. That's really surprising. And here we've got to say, what does naturalism give that certainty? Because they've researched for such a long time, and they still can't explain the gap between consciousness and matter, not even in the least bit. What does materialism give this certainty to claim that it is naive to believe in consciousness? I mean, immaterial consciousness. It's because we've done research for more than 100 years, and during this time, we've never come across something immaterial. In my opinion, that's naive because it's a conclusion that just doesn't work like that. And therefore, my idealism hasn't been questioned by the sciences at all. And it hasn't been shaken up. And I've got to add, what do the sciences offer us with their materialism regarding the meaning of life? Unfortunately, nothing. It's a very bleak world. That's how I feel as an idealist. I'd find it very bleak if I believed in it. And when materialism is that uncertain, when it is on quite shaky legs, when it comes to consciousness, then it doesn't have the right to dismiss something so wonderful as the idea that near-death experiences teach us something as significant as love. This is the message near-death experiences bring back to us. To give the living the meaning of life back, to love our fellow human beings, and to refrain from materialism as much as possible. I would say that all these things are classic moral questions, and these are extremely reinforced in near-death experiences. They are strengthened in the people who've had near-death experiences, but at the same time, it has also an effect on others who haven't had a near-death experience. Thus, it also has a very positive effect, morally speaking.
Which is being questioned by the naturalists.
Which is being questioned by the naturalists without having the least bit of competency in this field, because they've got nothing up their sleeves that would extend their naturalistic view when it comes to their experience. And therefore, insofar, I'm terribly idealistic. I think it's about all these other aspects that I just mentioned too.
Dr. Eberhard, again, you have shared some very insightful thoughts with us. Thank you very much for this interview.
It's been a pleasure.